Hi, everybody. This is Blaine DeSantis, and I welcome you to another edition of Books and Looks. Yes, it's our weekly podcast and voyage of discovery in the wonderful world of books, coming to you each and every week, anywhere you can find podcasts, such as Spotify or Apple Podcasts. You can also watch us now on YouTube, and you can get my book reviews on viewsonbooks.com. Today, we are joined by a really fine young author. Her name is Addison Armstrong. Young? She's in her 20s, and she's on her second major novel. This is an extremely good novel called The War Librarian, a dual timeline with World War I and the first class of female plebes at the U.S. Naval Academy. This is well-written, extremely well-researched. We find out what went on during the war. We find out what went on during this time with the Naval Academy and that first year of the ladies there. And there's a connection, and there's a twist, and it's a really, really fine book. So without any further ado, let's go right into our interview with Addison Armstrong. All right, friends, as I promised, we're with Addison Armstrong today. And Addison, welcome to Books and Looks.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here talking about The War Librarian.
Oh, yep, there it is, her newest book, The War Librarian. Look at that smile. If I was her age, I'd be smiling too. Ay, ay, ay. We have run the gamut, friends. We went from last week, which I think was our oldest person, Otho Eskin, and we've now got our youngest author, Addison Armstrong. You know, it's something, it doesn't matter how old you are if you've got creativity, and you, young lady, have great creativity. I'm so happy for you.
Thank you.
Anyway, as I said, you're the youngest person we've had. What got you started and wanting to write?
Yeah, I've always wanted to write. Since I was little, since I learned to read, so, kindergarten, whenever it was, I've always said I wanted to be a teacher and I wanted to be an author. And I did both. I was lucky enough that I really did know since I was 5 years old exactly what I wanted to do. And it was just because I love to read so much. I love to read, and so I wanted to write. And I always, would write little stories. When I was little, we were going through my closet recently, cleaning it out. We found some old ones, and one of my favorites was about an ant who gets revenge on the exterminators. He bakes like a poisonous pie and turns them into ants, to show them what it was like. So, it's gotten a little less wacky as time went on. But I've always been writing something.
When you were growing up, now, did you have any favorite authors or books that you liked?
I loved the classics, Nancy Drew. I loved anything mystery. I was probably in middle school when I started reading historical fiction. I loved Anne Rinaldi was one of my favorites. Another favorite was Margaret Peterson Haddock's. She wrote Uprising about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory.
Okay, yeah. Oh, yes. Wonderful. Yeah.
And my sister remembers that being the first book that ever made her cry. Like, it was one of the first real serious historical fiction books that either of us read as kids. And I'm in Manhattan now, and they actually just finally put up a memorial to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire victims at the building. The building has been there with just this little small plaque, and now there's this beautiful memorial. So those are some of my favorites.
All right. Well, that's great. I loved historical fiction. I was a huge fan of John Michener, and I read all those books, which took me forever. He's so wordy. And but I love them a lot. And historical fiction, great thing. And so that's what made you want to write historical fiction, because of those books that you were reading?
Just because I loved reading it so much,
Okay.
Yes.
Do you find it easy to do that type of writing?
I find it easier, I think, than I would find something else. Not easy, but easier. Because a lot of it's already there for you. You're not coming up with it out of nowhere. For The Light of Luna Park was my first novel, and it is about a fictional nurse who takes a baby to these Coney Island baby incubators where they saved these premature babies, but they were also part of a sideshow. And she was not real, but it was very easy to come up with her and her predicament because I wanted to reflect the real problem of the doctor who ran these sideshows, which was this moral, am I exploiting these babies? Am I saving them? And, it kind of is just ready-made for you. And you just need to slide those characters in there.
Well, that's really well. Now, Friends, a lot of you might not know this, but this young lady was in college when she wrote her first book. In college. How did you manage to do that while you were studying and everything else?
I don't think the answer is one my teachers will like, and I'm a teacher myself, so that's, unfortunate. I did a lot of it during class. I have never been great at listening. I'm much more interested in talking. And so I get bored. I'm not great at sitting still, so I would do a lot of it in class, and then it was a hobby. Like, I didn't think anything would come of it. I didn't expect to get published. So it was fun. There was no pressure. There were no stakes. So if I had 10 minutes between classes, if I had, not enough time to really do anything, but that's when I would grab that time to write. And so it really just felt like fun. And it ended up being the first full-length manuscript that I completed. Like I said, I wrote all throughout my childhood, but not a full-length novel. And went from there.
That's amazing. Interesting sidebar. I went to law school. I even graduated from law school. But while I was there, one of my best friends, he was like you. He didn't like to just listen too much. So he would write also. But he would write out calls to horse races. He was a huge horse race fan. So he would make up imaginary horse races and write out the whole call of the race during contract.
That's hilarious.
Yeah.
And did he pass law school?
He got it. No, after 1 year, he said, "We've had enough. You got to go." So
he said, "I don't want this. I don't want this."
Didn't want that. Nah, the two didn't mesh together. But Chris was wonderful. He used to write these, like I said, these horse race things. Yeah. So anyway, well, now you were a junior. Is that what did I read that right? You were a junior in college when you did this?
I was a junior when I wrote it, and I was a senior when it was published.
Oh my God. How did you do? Now, okay, and I'm not asking you to give away any professional secrets, but there are a lot of us out there. There are a lot of us out there, including me, who have started books, and we get intimidated. How were you able? Did you have to find an agent? How did you find a publisher? Because this is no little publisher, friends. He writes with, I think it's Putnam. This is one of the big boys.
Yes.
How did you do that?
Yes, I got very lucky. My agent is phenomenal. So going back to that, yes, I did have to find an agent. So I misspoke before I said it was the first full-length manuscript I completed. I had right before it done another. And I'd sent that one out to agents, just, doing the research online, finding out who was looking for what, emailing them cold. And I got lots of no's. And so while that was all happening, I started writing The Light of Luna Park sort of as a way to not just be focusing on all the rejection. By the time I'd really exhausted all of those first agents, I'd finished The Light of Luna Park. And so I started sending that one out instead. And that one got responses pretty quickly. It definitely still got some rejections. It's not like you won't. But I had 2 offers at the same time. And I had to then decide between those 2 agents.
Wow.
And signed with Melissa Danasco. I know it went from just hundreds of rejections to now I'm the one having to reject one of these agents, and I felt so bad about it. But Melissa's fabulous, and she used to be an editor. She edited for like 10 years. So we did a couple rounds back and forth of editing before sending it out to publishers. So that was probably October that I signed with her. January, she sent it out to about 15 different publishers. And we heard back from Tara at Putnam. And we weren't going to say no to that.
No, don't say that at all. No. Well, now, your senior year, are you going to class and doing publicity and tours and everything else?
So since I majored in elementary education, I was actually student teaching my senior year. So I was not in class, I was teaching class. So it was actually, I was in the classroom when Tara called for the first time. And it had been, it was set up where it would be when the kids were at PE. So I could talk. But I was on the phone sweeping up like an art project the kids had just done, talking to Tara. Like it was just surreal. I'm like, how is this real life while I'm sweeping up glitter off the floor? It was incredible. In terms of publicity and things, that didn't come till later. It's such a long publishing process. It was a lot more of the editing that I had to do then, the heavy lifting. But COVID hit. It was 2020. COVID hit. So I ended up here at home in Florida, and I had all the time in the world to edit.
Yeah. What a success story at such a young age. That's just wonderful. I hope this inspires all of you other people out there who are listening to write, because if you write and you got talent and a good story, you will persevere. You'll get it. Let's talk a little bit about. That's right. Let's talk a little bit about the War Librarian. What's this book about? What's the plot? Who are the main characters? Tell us a little bit about that.
So you could probably tell it better than I could, because you just read it and I have not read it since it came out. But it stresses me out too much. But it is dual timeline, and the first timeline is 1918, and our character is Emmeline. She's a shy, timid, bookish girl who lives in Washington, D.C., works at the dead letter office. And she ends up actually going overseas to France to serve as a base hospital librarian during World War I. And she pictures the job just being all about books, but it's a lot more than she bargained for. I'm sure it'll come up later, but she's dealing with issues of censorship and free speech and prejudice and discrimination and all of this. And then our other timeline is 1976, so vastly different. And it's about Kathleen, whose grandmother, Nellie, also served in World War I as an ambulance driver. And Kathleen is sort of following her grandmother's example and enrolling in the Naval Academy. And it's the first year that the Naval Academy has accepted women. And it is not a walk in the park. The things I read, and most of them are in here, are just astounding. I didn't make this up. These are things that happened. And so Kathleen is dealing with all of that. She's accomplishing her dream, but it's not what she thought it would be. And then there are personal tragedies and secrets threatening to come out that put all of it in peril.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, I was wondering if you might have a passage you might want to read to us to get my followers even more excited about this book.
I don't know if it'll work.
Oh, it will.
So I picked one just from the beginning, not give away too much. So it's page 5, and this is Emmeline, and she is currently on the ship headed from the U.S. over to Europe, where she will be that base hospital librarian. So my mother had lived a colorful life, and that was what I wanted to do now. I was tired of being forgettable, invisible Emmeline, the girl who handled dead letters about more interesting lives than her own. I pulled myself away from the ship's railing. If I was going to embark on a new life, I had to stop gazing backward into the past. I didn't have to watch the shoreline until it receded. My feet slid on the deck as the ship roiled, but I didn't fall. I took one ginger step at a time, finding my footing, as I explored the place that would be my home for the next 2 weeks. I couldn't pretend I liked it. The USS Aeolus had been seized from Germany's luxury cruise line months ago, but the Germans had ransacked her beforehand. The ship was a metal beast, hulking in size, and the floral wallpaper that peeked through in spots as a reminder of its past life only made it eerier. The razzle-dazzle war paint on deck, zigzagging black and white lines that crashed and intercepted at seemingly random intervals, dizzied me. I suppose that was the point. The camouflage didn't aid the ship in blending in, it simply disoriented the enemy so they couldn't grasp the size, speed, or direction of the ship. The enemy. I'd read about them in the newspapers and prayed for the men abroad, but I'd never expected to enter a world in which I'd be their target. A world in which I was on a Navy transport ship so vulnerable to German U-boats that we were surrounded by a convoy of ships meant to protect us. I continued past the mess hall, its polished wood floor suggesting a past as a ballroom or first-class dining room, and into the belly of the ship. Here, finally, was something familiar. The ship library. There wasn't much to it beyond a few crates of books and a plank of wood that had been fashioned into a sign, Transport from American Library Association for all men on board. The room had low metal ceilings, and my pumps echoed ominously on metal floors crisscrossed with hatches and handles and levers. But I knew already that I would be more comfortable here than anywhere else on the ship. I set to work immediately sorting the books by genre and author, my hands moving almost of their own accord as I went through everything from textbooks on engineering and mechanical handbooks to collections of poetry and authors like Twain. In this comfortable, familiar space, it was easier to remember why I'd chosen to join the war effort overseas. The decision went back further than the conversation at Camp Meade when they'd asked if I'd be interested, further even than that day a month ago when I donated a pile of books to the Library War Service and mentioned to the girl at the desk that I wanted to be a war librarian. It went back to the day Nicholas's letter had landed on my desk at the dead letter office. The letter meant for another woman, the letter I'd opened, read, and responded to, the letter I'd stolen. That is the end of chapter 1.
There you go. Wonderful. That gets us right in there. Yep, that gets us started. She's on her way over. I love the zigzag colors, too. I never realized they painted ships like that.
Yeah, isn't that bizarre? If you look at the pictures, it's very strange looking, very disorienting, which was the point, of course.
Yeah, exactly. Wow, that's really something. That's thank you so much for reading that. That's a great job. Now, research for this. Did you have to do a ton of research to get everything? Where'd you do this?
Yeah, I'm lucky that, I can do so much of it online. I don't know how people did it before the internet was so, readily available. For Emmeline, so for the librarian, the dead letter office, World War I, all of that, I was lucky enough to use several primary documents. There are online, there are bulletins and meeting minutes from the American Library Association, which in conjunction with the War Department led this push to send millions of books overseas. And that was their main endeavor. They were mostly sending books. They said a book for every soldier. Actually sending librarians over was something they didn't start until late in the war when it was almost over. And most of the librarians actually ended up there after the war had ended, where they were still very necessary for convalescing patients that wouldn't be able to return to the U.S. for months and months on end. I had it happen a little bit earlier than that. Some of them were there earlier. But a lot of those primary documents, you could read exactly what they thought. You could look at pictures of the men in the camps with those books, which if you haven't looked up, I have a couple on my website. They are incredible just to see these men. If you read their first person accounts, they were just desperate for books. They were desperate for something to get them out of this world that they were in. And most of them at the time were bedridden. They couldn't walk around. They couldn't leave. And so they really, really needed something to help them escape.
We're joined by somebody here. Yeah, who's that?
Yeah, this is my sister's cat, Christopher.
Oh, well, there
you're not being very friendly.
Well, he's being very friendly. He's taking over the show. He wants to be on TV.
Yeah, he wants to say something.
It's okay.
All right, bye.
All right. Well, then let's talk about the naval situation. U.S. Naval Academy. With that, your details that are ridiculously good. It's unbelievable.
And I have one person to thank for that, and it is in the author notes. Sharon Hanley Disher wrote a book called First Class, and she actually was in that first class at the Naval Academy. And her book is fiction, but it is heavily based on things that she and her friends went through. I think one of the characters was based on someone real, and the other character was a composite of people she knew. So I read that, and it was just invaluable. I mean, the details, the things you never would have thought of. And she actually wrote to me. She read The War Librarian. And she wrote to me, and she was so honored that I had used First Class to do my research and that I had represented, things so accurately. And I was like, oh, because, I had no idea when I saw her name in my inbox. It could have been, you got this completely wrong, but it was.
That's great. That's great. Now, did you always, when you started this project, well, I'll call the book a project to begin with, did you always envision a dual timeline situation?
Yeah, they have largely been my favorite to read. So it was sort of natural to start writing those. I did it with The Light of Luna Park. And then obviously I chose to do it again for The War Librarian. I think it has some benefits in terms of writing it. There's a little bit of natural suspense in there. Sometimes the reader knows more than the character does. And therefore is just waiting for the other shoe to drop, or the character, you're looking for the connection. It kind of adds in a little bit of mystery in a book that's not a mystery. I think it's also just one of the things that draws me to dual timeline is obviously you're going to compare the two timelines in your head. And that forces us to sort of subconsciously also compare today. So we're looking at 1918 compared to 1976 compared to 2024 now, and thinking, wow, women have come so far, but also they haven't. And the Army has, but also not.
Okay.
And so I think that's a benefit of them as well.
Now, did you write each person's section individually? Like you wrote all of Emmeline's first, then you wrote all of the other one for Kathleen, or did you go back, forth?
That is a fabulous question. When I wrote that first manuscript, the one that was rejected a million times, I did it alternating. I did it in the order that you would read it. So one character, other character, first, second. And the feedback that I got from a couple of those agents was that one storyline was really strong, the other one not so much. And so that drove me to, when I wrote The Light of Luna Park, separate them completely. I wrote all of Althea's storyline and then all of Stella's, because it forced me to give both of them their own arc in a way that I hadn't really done with that first manuscript. So because that worked, I did the War Librarian the same way. I wrote all of Emmeline's and then all of Kathleen's.
Yeah,
it makes it harder on the back end.
Yeah, but I'll tell you what, I can't imagine switching back and forth, writing these dual timelines. That's got to be hard to do.
Yes, with the different historical time period. Yeah, there are definitely things that make it easier and harder both ways. It's really hard to mesh them at the end when you write them separately. I would have to add in like a filler chapter because I can't have this revealed until that, all of that, like it's like a puzzle. And I know other authors do it different ways, but that's the way that I find best.
That works for you. It certainly does. Now, do you have a favorite character or a favorite timeline in this?
That's a great question. I definitely was more excited initially about writing Emmeline. She felt more like me. I was really fascinated by, the whole idea of the government finding books valuable in times of war. The whole storyline I was just absolutely obsessed with it. And the Naval Academy storyline was sort of like, I need a second timeline. It didn't end up that way. I loved writing about Kathleen. The details and everything were just so shocking that it was fascinating, and it made you mad. I mean, it made me mad to read about and write about these horrible things that happened not so long ago. I mean, my uncle said, "Oh yeah, I remember when they let women into the Naval Academy," and no, he doesn't remember World War I. Obviously, he was not around. So I'm thinking, so many of my readers were here. They might have no awareness of what was going on in Annapolis, but they were here. They were alive. They were walking around. And so I ended up really enjoying writing that one, maybe more so. But I think I personally am more like Emmeline.
Well, I started out, I kept going back and forth, but by the end, I settled on the 1976 timeline. Very enjoyable. Maybe one of the reasons is one of my high school friends was in the Naval Academy from 71 to 75.
Oh, really?
Just missed all this.
Okay, so barely missed it.
Just barely missed it, but that drew me to it. Well, that's just wonder. You also got in the Emmeline timeline. You got into stuff about some of the horrors that she faced when she went into these makeshift wards for wounded people, and you used the maxillofacial patients in the book, the people who've lost their jaws or things like that. And that was fascinating. Had you intended to do something like that, or did that just go along as you did your research?
It definitely kept popping up in the research. And I think I really wanted to emphasize why the men were so desperate for these books, because they were. And to really understand that, you had to understand how hellish what they were going through was. And World War I was really one of the first times that you see this type of injury on such a massive scale. And just the brutality of it is so different from previous wars. And I really wanted that to be in there. One, because Emmeline's not used to that world. It makes her uncomfortable. And two, because it shows us how important those books were.
Very good. And friends, if you are interested in this, there's a wonderful, wonderful book by Lindsay Fitzharris called The Facemaker, a true story about Dr. I think his name is Harold Gillies, who was in World War I and is the guy who basically figured out how to help these people with plastic surgery and reconstructive surgery. It's a great, great book. And when I read your part of the book about that, I kept thinking about Lindsay's book. And so I appreciate that you put that in your book. I really do, because that really brought it right to me.
It's funny you say that because my editors kept telling me to take some of it out. They thought it was just too gruesome. So I kept getting little notes, and, they do track changes in Microsoft. So I kept getting little notes on the side that were like, take this line out, take this line out. This is gross. No one wants to read this. And I, as we said, I'm young, and they've been in the business. They know what they're doing. There's very little I can push back on. If they want something, they pretty much get it. But I thought, I think this is important. I think it's disingenuous to talk about World War I and pretend it was not that bad.
Exactly.
And so I kept addressing all their other comments and sending it back with those untouched. And they kept sending it back with the same comments back and forth until finally they gave up.
You wore them down.
I won that small battle. Yes.
Good for you. I'm glad.
And so I'm glad to hear you say, that you think those details were important.
They were. There are other details that are important that people don't realize about. I don't even know if we have a dead letter office anymore. Who sends letters? I don't know. I don't know. Maybe. I don't know. The other thing is, and I like to touch on this a little bit, the hospital wards. Some were decent, and then some were terrible, where they kept these poor people. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the officers, of course, had much better quarters in the hospitals than anybody else did. But then there was also an issue of race, which was a big issue during the war, in that so many African American soldiers went and fought and risked their lives, and then went back and were, put right back in Jim Crow South, lynching, segregation, all these, horrific parts of our history. And so, again, it felt disingenuous to write about World War II without talking about those stories. And so some of the worst conditions in the hospital that Emily witnesses are in those tents where most of the Black patients are clustered together, be they African Americans or immigrants to America. And it was difficult finding a lot of information on all of that. It's definitive that lots of African Americans were not given the respect of, proper battle. They were forced to dig graves and have these, drudgery, have this, these horrible jobs. Not that being in battle is any less horrible, but, it was an issue of respect. And they were segregated in the troops themselves. As to whether they were segregated in hospitals, it seems to have been largely up to the individual commanders in charge. So they tried to separate them, but it wasn't mandated. It was very murky. And that's reflected, I think, a little bit in the book. But you definitely see that those more open air tents, the ones where different illnesses are smushed together and they're all going to, they're contagious, all of those things are disproportionately affecting those African American soldiers, those immigrant soldiers, but also any of those enlisted men.
Tell me, did they continue this program, the ALA, up into World War II, Korea? Do you know anything about that?
I don't know about Korea. I do know that in World War II, they had a different but similar program where they would send miniature copies of books. They would print them out, and I'm going blank on what they called them now, like service editions maybe. And they sent those overseas. But World War II, they also had a lot of publicity about how America's the good guys because we don't ban books, and the Nazis do. And that was fascinating to me, knowing that in World War I, there were books banned even while they were sending them overseas.
Mm-hmm. To the soldiers. Right. Which gets Emily in a little bit of hot water, to be honest with you. Yeah, because she didn't like that idea of that. So that's fascinating.
She's a librarian.
Yeah. No doubt. And so then we go back to 1976. And again, I love that timeline. And Kathleen, right? Her name Kathleen? Okay. Kathleen she always wanted to go into the academy. But when she got there, I got the feeling that she felt it was more personal to herself and didn't want to communicate issues with her roommates or other things. It was just like me against the world, when there were some other, around 80 or 90 other ladies there.
Yeah. So that's something I read, that they were very much made to feel like they could not communicate with each other. The men did not like the idea of them all grouping together. It sort of othered them in a way. And then the administration intentionally kept them apart. They were really only together in their rooms to sleep. The rest of the time they were kept apart because they didn't want them to be able to get together and talk about all of the things that they were facing. And you know this from the book. The mutiny that Kathleen attends, organized by Janice and Marcia. Marcia is invented, but Janice is real. Janice Buxbaum was a real student who organized a meeting just for them to air their grievances, not to the public, not to the press, just amongst each other, because they had things to share. They had dead rats in their mailboxes. They had obscene things on the bathroom mirrors and carved in the peanut butter jar. They had their clothes stolen. They had, all manner of, harmless prank all the way up to sexual harassment and even assault happening to them. And they just needed a space to talk about it. And that was declared a mutiny. And Janice was threatened with disciplinary action. She ended up actually becoming a really good liaison between the administration and the women in the next several years. But it was iffy for a while. She could have been kicked out for that. And that's all in the book because they really didn't get a chance.
Right. Well, there's some fascinating parts you talk about. For instance, when they go and they get their initial uniform, they're given heels. They have to wear 3-inch heels.
It's ridiculous.
Like, that really happened?
And then really when they went to fix them, instead of just issuing them new shoes, they chopped off the heels. So now they're on these uneven, limping around.
Oh, my word. Oh, my word.
It was ridiculous.
It was.
Ridiculous.
And then the purses.
I was about to say that. The purses. Awful. It was all a mess. So you obviously know, but for the listeners, it didn't occur to them that women would need to carry around, feminine hygiene products because, they apparently never met a woman before. And so they had no plan for that until some of the women asked, hey, what am I supposed to do? So they required all women to carry purses with them at all times. But the men then complained, thinking, but, they're going to put study materials in these purses and have an unfair advantage. So they got rid of the purses. Now purses are banned again, and they sewed pocket. It was all a mess. They hadn't faced the reality of having women at the academy. And that was very clearly reflected in the way that they were.
And some of this is understandable because they never gave it a thought. They were told this is what's going to happen, but the practical realities of what this entailed, that's something completely different. Completely different. Wow. Well, you do a great job of that. I tell you, you really sit there and put us right in there. You really feel for these ladies. And it's interesting. If you want to read Sharon Disher's book, I strongly recommend First Class. I'm going to do that. As a matter of fact. That's wonderful. They really, it taught me a whole lot about this. And, what these women had to go through. I mean, they were even at one point, I think they were thinking of putting her up for treason or some sort of stupid charge because she's set up by the men. It's unbelievable. In that book, now in your book, okay, there's one guy who's the instigator. What a jerk that guy is. Is that based on a real person?
He's not based on a specific person, more a composite of the treatment that I read about in general, overall.
Did any of those people end up getting disciplined themselves once the administration found out what they were doing?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay,
I cannot with 100% certainty say no, but definitely not to my knowledge.
Didn't think so. You put in a twist, which we're not going to give away. Wow. Did you have that with you from the beginning, or as you knew that was oh
Yes.
my. Well, she puts in a twist, friends, that is really, really fascinating, really interesting. I loved it. I'll tell you, it's so good. And you got to know, Emmeline is not an American-born individual. Emmeline, from back in World War I, she was born in Russia, if I'm not mistaken.
Russia. Mm-hmm.
Right. So she comes over here as an immigrant, and she has a friend whose name is Nicholas. Right? And that's whose letter she intercepts. And next thing you know, she's on the boat, and she ends up meeting him. He's Russian also. They were friends as kids, and now they meet again. Now, how did she get from the dead letter office to being a librarian? How'd that happen?
Initially, the dead letter office is what caught my eye. And I just found it so fascinating. I couldn't include most of it in the book, but it was incredible, the things that they found. They had a little museum of things that they'd gotten, packages with. They had a dead cobra. They had a wedding cake. They had a suit of armor, weapons, jewelry, just the most bizarre things. Definitely worth looking up. There's some pictures. It's just like towering piles of just the most bizarre assortment of things.
Where do you find that?
Yes.
Do they have a website for that?
Where did I find it all? I think the Smithsonian might have a little bit of information on it, and then the postal services websites. But there are several places you can find pictures and newspaper articles as well. And so that's what first captured my interest. And then I stumbled across the librarians as well, and I thought, it seems like they might attract the same sort of person, these two jobs. And I actually originally had a lot more of the dead letter office in the book. She was not already on her way overseas when it started. It was probably 100 pages of her in DC before that. My editor, I think rightfully so, had me cut it, condense it, have it in backstory, so that, we could get going on the meat of the story right away. But I really wish I could have included just more of those historical details about the dead letter office, because it's bizarre.
Again, all these details are just wonderful. Now, do you have a time period that you like to write in? Do you like 20th century? Have you thought about writing in other centuries? What do you like?
I've definitely thought about writing in others. Currently, all 4 timelines in both books have been 20th century. It's a little bit more approachable. It's easier to research. It's easier to find newspaper photos, all of those things. And I don't need to do as much research about the day-to-day life, because, it's enough in our culture that we know sort of what it was like. I do have a children's manuscript that takes place in the 1880s, so a little bit earlier. And I am toying with some other ideas that are also a little bit earlier. So we'll see.
Wow, wonderful. Now, do you have a time of day? Do you write every day? Well, you teach. What's your writing schedule? How do you do this?
I don't have much of one. It's a little bit all over the place. I do take the subway to work, so sometimes if I'm not too tired on the subway, that's a great time. I can't do the research because I'm underground, so there's no internet, but I can do the writing. Weekends, summer's a big perk, obviously, but it's not nearly as fast. People are so impressed that I did it in college, but it was definitely easier to do in college than while teaching a bunch of rambunctious, third graders.
Wow. Well, that's really something. I tell you. Well, now tell me, what's next for Addison Armstrong? You working on another book?
I'm working on several things. Not sure what's going to be next.
Well, let's hear all about it.
Yeah, I have a children's manuscript completed, but I need to find a separate agent for that in the children's world. So it's like starting from scratch. So who knows if that'll go anywhere, hopefully. It's a historical mystery ghost story in New Orleans in 1883. And then I have 2 completed manuscripts, adult historical fiction manuscripts. But they're just issues with like oversaturation of certain genres and certain time periods and things in the publishing industry. They don't want to publish them right now. They want to save them for later. So I am trying to figure out what my next project is going to be. I've got a couple ideas, but nothing up.
So there are 2 other books, adult historical fiction books out there, which are done, well, not completed, but they're basically there, ready to go. You're
They're
just
drafted.
waiting for the people.
Waiting for the market to change.
Isn't that something? Isn't that something? Wow.
It's not something you think about before you go into it.
No, you don't.
The business side of it.
One of the first times I wrote you, I mentioned how much I appreciated starting with World War I, because it's sort of been forgotten and what went on there.
There's so much World War II and not a lot of World War I.
Not much Korea either. You ever notice that? Korea doesn't have a lot.
Yeah, it might.
Doesn't have a lot
nothing.
there.
I mean, almost nothing.
No, we didn't do too good there. I tell you. Well, that is just you brighten up the day. I'll tell you, you're a wonderful writer.
So sweet.
And no, I'm telling you why. The sales are going well. You're doing well. Do you go on promotional tours and things such as that?
Luna came out in COVID, so there was not a whole lot that they were doing at the time. I was able to do a virtual launch event at Parnassus Books in Nashville with Ariel Mahan, who wrote Codename Helene, and I was Anastasia, which was fabulous. And then for the War Librarian, I got to do a little bit more. I did a couple events in Louisiana, a couple events in New York City, one at Bryant Park, one at Parnassus, again in Nashville, and then a lot of online things, podcasts and interviews and things like that.
And Nashville is important because this young lady went to Vanderbilt. That's where you were at.
Yes. I was there for 6 years, four in school, then 1 year for a master's, and then 1 year after that.
I came down to Vanderbilt and Furman. I didn't choose Vanderbilt.
Oh, really?
Went to Furman. I that 1,000-acre campus, it just drew me there, okay, with the lake and the golf course and everything else. And I love Vandy, though. Oh, I liked it so much, but I didn't want to be in the city. And so I said,
Interesting.
Yeah, so it's one of those things. But wow. Well, Addison, I don't want to keep you any longer. You're actually on vacation, and you're joining us from your parents' home in Florida. Say hello to everybody. And they've got to be awfully proud of you. You're doing a great job. Thank you so very much. You, like I said, you're delightful. And I really appreciate you coming on and talking with us today on Books and Looks.
No, thank you so much. This is fabulous. I always love talking, like I said. So thank you.
Very good. Hey, friends, we'll be right back. As I told you, friends, what a fine young lady and author. I tell you, I was very impressed. You're going to love this book when you read it because it's just outstanding. And you say, well, Blaine, what are you looking at? Well, I'm telling you what, I'm looking at a couple things. I'm doing some research for the Dead Letter Office. Yeah. Doing some research on that book, First Class, by a lady's name is Sharon Disher. I want to read that book. I want to look into that about that First Ladies at the Naval Academy. And I'm going to be doing some looking at Lindsay Fitzharris's book about the face maker, about the reconstruction of faces that took place with plastic surgery and everything during World War I. These are all books that are great, that are out there. I'm going to be looking at all of these in the next couple of weeks. So anyway, hey, listen, on behalf of viewsonbooks.com, my good friends at Podcast Studio X, this is Blaine DeSantis for Books and Looks, saying may all your leaves be pages in a book.